Joe Flacco with that 470 yards. That's good enough to top the list as the highest quarterback as far as passing yards go this season with 470. Welcome to Just the Stats, NFL Top 10's for Tuesday. All right, well, we had Monday night game. Not a lot to say about it, really. Wasn't that great of a game. It was a good win for the Arizona Cardinals. The Dallas Cowboys just could not get anything together. And for a change, the Arizona Cardinals did not give the game away. They have been losing games in the fourth quarter in just the most strangest ways. But this time, the Cardinals held on for a 27-17 lead, which puts them at 3-5, as well as the Dallas Cowboys now being 3-5-1. And the Dallas Cowboys defense, they only gave up 27, which for them, I guess, isn't that bad, but it's not that good. And Arizona's defense is really much better than you would think. They played very well, actually, the defense. It's just at the end of the games, for whatever reason, the things change and they lose, but not today, not last night, I should say. And that was in Dallas, so that was a good game for the Arizona Cardinals. Now, the big decision for Arizona Cardinals is, will Jacoby Brissett remain the quarterback, or will they put Kyler Murray back in? If you listen to the announcers last night, they're saying stick with Brissett, and that could be the truth. He just seems to, I don't know if he has a better grasp of how the offense should run, or he just does it better. I'm not sure, but we'll see what they do as far as that goes. At least he gets the ball to Marvin Harrison a little bit more than Murray seems to do. But anyway, that game wasn't too bad. No outstanding players in the game, really. I mean, as far as these top 10 stats that we're going to look at in today's episode of Top 10's from last weekend of football. So from Thursday to Monday, we'll look at the top 10's in different categories. We'll start with the quarterbacks, and neither one of these quarterbacks quite made it into the top 10, except for in the sack department, where they both were sacked 5 times. That will be a category they make it into. Otherwise, and Dak Prescott, as far as rushing as a quarterback, will make it in there as well. So let's take a look at these stats then, and we'll start with quarterbacks. And the quarterback who had the huge game was Joe Flacco. 470 yards in his game in a loss. It's really a devastating loss. And if you catch any of the media that's afterwards, some of the offensive players like Chase Brown making comments about the defense. Cincinnati Bengals got up 42 to, I guess, 40 with only less than a minute to go, and Chicago went right down the field, scored another touchdown, and won the game. So despite 470 yards, 4 touchdowns by Joe Flacco, they lose. So Joe Flacco was the leading quarterback as far as passing yards go. 470 yards on 31 out of 47 passes, 4 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. Daniel Jones was second. He had 342 yards in a loss. He had 31 completions as well, but had 50 attempts and only 1 touchdown, 3 interceptions. This was by far the worst game that the Indianapolis Colts had. They didn't look good at all in their loss, 27-20. So many turnovers. And actually, when you think about it, the game, I mean, they lost by a touchdown, but so many turnovers. I mean, Jones was sacked more times this week, 5 times. And He threw three interceptions. It was just a bad game. He also fumbled the ball twice. I mean, 5 turnovers by Daniel Jones alone. You know, games like this happen. Pittsburgh Steelers defense, which hadn't been playing that well really, played much better against the Colts and found some ways or exposed some ways to beat the Indianapolis Colts. So we'll see how the Colts rebound. And for the Pittsburgh Steelers, they needed this win to stay on top in their division. We'll be looking at the standings probably tomorrow for sure, not today. So those were the top 2. Sam Darnold in a win, 330 yards passing. Now he 21 for 24, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception. So he had 3 incomplete passes in this game, and one of those was an interception. Joe Flacco had, going back up to him, he had 2 interceptions in this game, but the last one was a Hail Mary at the end of the game when they were out of time and they had to throw it. He tried to throw it about 50 yards. He just doesn't have the arm to throw it 50 yards. It came kind of a lame duck, and it was intercepted. But otherwise, he only had 1 interception the entire previous part of the game. So those quarterbacks, Flacco, Jones, Darnold, were the only quarterbacks to throw for 300 or more yards. Jared Goff and Geno Smith, both in losses, threw for 284 yards. Those were your next 2. So those are your top 5. And if you go to YouTube and go to Just the Stats NFL on YouTube, you'll find the video of this and you'll see the charts. I'll have them up there posted on how all the quarterbacks in the top 10 did. I'm not going to go through all of them, just going through the highlights. So Joe Flacco with that 470 yards, that's good enough to top the list as the highest quarterback as far as passing yards go this season with 470. Russell Wilson had been at the top for quite a while, actually since week 2 with 450 yards. And so Joe Flacco takes that now with 470. Justin Herbert is third with 420. Those are your top 3. And what's fascinating about this is all 3 of those are in a loss. So despite the amount of yards they were throwing for, it was all 3 in losses. Now, Russell Wilson and Herbert, well, Wilson's game was just a back and forth game as well with the Cowboys. Herbert was trying to come back, and Joe Flacco was a back and forth game too, where they pulled into the lead. It wasn't like it was a catch-up game as much as trying to hold on to the lead until the end, and they just didn't get the ball last. Well, they did, but when they got the ball, there was like 12 seconds to go, so it was a little bit different. But Joe Flacco now is top of the list. The only player this week to make it into the top 10 as far as passing yards go by quarterbacks. Now that total by Joe Flacco, one more stat here, put him at number 4 all time for Cincinnati Bengals passing yards in a single game. Joe Burrow has 2 of the top 3, including the number 1 total, which was over 500 yards, 525 yards Joe Burrow threw for this was in December of 21. It looks like right around Christmas, the Sunday right after Christmas. 525 yards. Boomer Esiason from the past in 1990 threw for 490. And then Joe Burrow again with 481. And then Joe Flacco, 470 yards. So 4th best all-time Cincinnati Bengals in a single game. All right, let's look at some passing touchdowns this week. Wow, we had 5 players throw for 4 touchdowns this week. That's incredible. And like Lamar Jackson, 4 touchdowns, no interceptions. He only threw the ball. He had 18 completions, 4 of them for touchdowns, only threw for 204 yards, and yet had 4 touchdowns. And that was in a win. Usually if you throw 4 touchdowns, you'd think you win, but that's not the case. Joe Flacco for the Bengals lost against the Bears with 4. He had 4 touchdowns. And Geno Smith for the Raiders threw 4 touchdowns in a loss to the Jacksonville Jaguars. So, like I said, generally you would expect to win a game with that many touchdown passes, but no, not the case. Now, Matthew Stafford on this list again with another 4 interceptions. When we look at another Matthew Stafford for the Rams had 4 touchdown passes, 0 interceptions, I should say. So touchdown passes. But when we look at the total, he's leading the NFL in touchdown passes right now. All right. Those are some of the players with the touchdown passes. Now, when we look at, though, for the season, with those 4 touchdown passes, they just added to the total of times a player has thrown for 4 touchdown passes. That's up to 16 players so far this season. Like I said, Matthew Stafford's on that list maybe once. I know he's on there for 4 once, maybe twice. He's also one of the 2 players who's thrown for 5 touchdowns, and that's Matthew Stafford threw for 5 touchdowns in week 7 in a win. And then Jared Goff for the Lions threw 5 touchdowns in week 2, also for a win. So those are the only 2 quarterbacks so far that have thrown 5 touchdown passes in a single game. And like I said, it's happened 16 times with a player throwing for 4. All right. Next up, quarterback interceptions. Now, this wasn't too bad. You had 2 quarterbacks. Like I said, Daniel Jones, worst game of the season for him. 3 interceptions in the game. He was 31 out of 50, 342 yards, 1 touchdown pass, 3 interceptions. That was in a loss. And then Joe Flacco, as I mentioned, threw 2 for the Bengals in their loss to the Bears. Now, in that game, like I said, the last one he threw was at the very end of the game, last play of the game. But still accounts for 2 interceptions. Now, there's been 13 quarterbacks this last week in week 9 who threw 1 interception. So 15 of the quarterbacks at least threw 1 interception in this past weekend. Now, with those 3 that Daniel Jones threw, he jumps up there with 9 other times this season that a quarterback has thrown for 3 interceptions. No one's thrown for more than 3, though you do have 3 players on this list twice. Geno Smith, 2 weeks, he's done it. He's thrown for 3 interceptions. Jake Browning did it twice, and he was benched in favor of Flacco. And then Tua Tagovailoa threw 3 interceptions twice. Back-to-back weeks, he did it. So those are your 3 players that have been on this list twice. But Daniel Jones joins that list of players who's thrown 9 interceptions. Well, he's thrown 3 in a single game. He's on the top 9 players there. All right, let's move over to one more category, and that's looking at these sacks. Now, this past week, in week 9, Justin Herbert, this is interesting because usually this is not the way it goes, and this happened to Drake May before too, but Drake May for the Patriots was sacked 6 times, and Justin Herbert for the Chargers was sacked 6 times, but both of those were in wins. This happened last week when Drake May was sacked 6 times as well. I think 5 of those were by Myles Garrett, if I remember right. But they win the game, which is not, when you get sacked that many times, usually you're not going to win. So like Jared Goff and Daniel Jones were sacked 5 times, and both of those were in losses. Dak Prescott, like I said yesterday, and Jacoby Brissett in last night's game, both of those quarterbacks were sacked 5 times, but Brissett came out with the win in that game. Cam Ward's on the list again with 4 times he was sacked in a loss. He's leading the NFL overall on the season for most times being sacked. But 6 times again for Drake May. I mean, I don't know if he's holding the ball too long. I don't think he has the greatest receivers. They're all decent, but none of them are a true number 1. And so maybe he's having difficulty finding an open receiver. He runs around a little bit, then he ends up getting sacked. Probably also why he's one of the leading quarterbacks as far as rushing yards. Now, on the season, though, with the 6 sacks, none of those were high enough to make it into the top 5. They did make it after that because there's 12 times a quarterback's been sacked 6 times. But the number 1 still is Justin Fields, who had, I think that bye week, or no, that was, I can't remember. Let me see. Did they have a bye week? I know they won their game, the last game they played. But either way, he leads the NFL with 9 sacks in a single game. And then Trevor Lawrence twice, and this was back-to-back weeks, was sacked 7 times. This was in week 6 and 7. And fortunately, they had a bye week. They corrected things. He was not sacked the other day against the Raiders 7 times. In fact, he was only sacked once. So they got back to the way they should be playing. Trevor Lawrence was not hanging on to that ball so much, so he's only sacked once. Now, Andy Dalton in week 8 was sacked 7 times. And listening to the announcers for that game with the Panthers and the Green Bay Packers, which the Panthers won in Green Bay, Bryce Young was in the game, and the feeling was he may not be completely healed, but a Bryce Young at 80% is better than Andy Dalton at 100%. So they had Bryce Young come in, and he held up all right. And they ended up winning that game against the Packers 16-13. I mean, Bryce Young was only sacked 1 time, threw an interception, but he only threw the ball. He had 20 attempts, only 11 completions for a little over 100 yards. Their objective in that game was to run the ball. They ran the ball 33 times in that game. I mean, Rico Dowdle, which was smart on their part, put him back as the number 1 running back, and he ran for 130 yards. So their goal was to just run the ball, try to manage the clock, and they came out with a win. So they are, to me, the surprise of the season. We'll talk about when we get to the standings. But as far as where I thought they would be and where they are right now. All right, I think that's it for the quarterbacks. Let's move on to the running backs. Now, Kyle Mononagay filled in for Swift for the Bears and ran for 176 yards. I was fortunate on my fantasy team to pick him up because I had Swift as well. And when I saw that Swift wasn't playing, I was able to pick up Kyle Mononagay, and he ran for 176 yards. So that was good. And they won that game. That was that crazy game with the Bengals where the Bears won 47-42. Rico Dowdle for the Panthers, as I said, the Panthers tried to give Chubbard back the starting position, but after 2 weeks of just mediocre play, they put Rico Dowdle back in there, and he came through with another 130 yards. Derrick Henry had 119 yards, another 100-yard game for him. He hasn't had that many. And then James Cook again, another 100-yard game, 114. Kyron Williams, 114. And Christian McCaffrey had 106. Those top 6 players, the only ones over 100 yards this week. So good games by them. Christian McCaffrey continues to be the number 1 player as far as scrimmage yards goes. He's just been incredible. And we'll look at that when we get to it. Now on the season, these numbers, Kyle Mononagay's 176 yards puts him at number 4 all-time this season as far as single game numbers go. He's the 4th best rushing yard total. He's the only one from week 9 to make it into the top 10. And Rico Dowdle, as I mentioned earlier, he's got the number 2 and 3 spot. And he did have the number 1 spot for 3 weeks until James Cook last week had 216 yards. But Rico Dowdle had 206. They're the only players so far over 200 yards this season in a single game. So good games for them. Rico Dowdle's been one of the number 1. They showed a stat in the game where he's over the last, 5 weeks or something, despite the fact that he was on the bench or coming off the bench and running, was still the number 1 running back as far as rushing yards go in the last 4 or 5 weeks. So good for him. And we'll see him out there probably much more. And the way if this is the strategy of the Carolina Panthers is to run the ball primarily if they can manage it, you should see some pretty good numbers out of Rico Dowdle. Now, in rushing touchdowns, there are 3 players who had 2 touchdowns. What's crazy about this is 2 of those were quarterbacks. Josh Allen and Trevor Lawrence both had 2 rushing touchdowns. And then Rico Dowdle for the Panthers had 2 as well. There were 19 players with 1 rushing touchdown over this last weekend of the NFL. Now, Trevor Lawrence, one of his was one of those quick dives, which is not my favorite play, where he sticks the ball over the goal line, because he has fumbled it that way. And you think the defense is looking to try to knock it out, but he got it across the line in that little dive play for a touchdown. And then he did run one in from, I don't know, somewhere within 10 yards. It was about 10 yards. He ran it in. But those 2 players, Josh Allen and Trevor Lawrence, both had 2 touchdowns rushing. Now in the season, Jonathan Taylor, boy, he was stymied. But he's got 3 times this season, he's had 3 touchdowns in a single game. So impressive as far as that goes. But this last week, he was stymied. The Pittsburgh Steelers really went after him. He had 14 carries for 45 yards and 0 touchdowns in the game. Now, Daniel Jones did have 1 rushing touchdown. But Jonathan Taylor still has 3 times he's had 3 touchdowns in a single game. And then Cam Scatterbo, a rookie, as well as Quinshon Judkins, a rookie for the Browns, both have 1 time where they had 3 touchdowns in a single game. So far, the last 2 times it was done was in week 7. So it hasn't been done the last couple of weeks. But those are the only players. No one's had 4 touchdowns in a single game, and 5 times it's happened with 3. And Jonathan Taylor having done it himself 3 times. All right, now when we're looking at quarterbacks in rushing yards this past week, you had 4 quarterbacks with more than 50 yards, which is quite a bit more than Bo Nix, who had 36 for the Broncos in a win. But Justin Herbert had 57 for the Chargers in their win, 57 rushing yards. Jackson Dart for the Giants had 56 rushing yards, but in a loss. And then Caleb Williams for the Bears had 53 in a win. Jaden Daniels for the Commanders, 51 in a loss. So you can't correlate rushing yards by a quarterback to wins all the time, but those are your top 4. Jaden Daniels was hurt in that game, so we'll see what happens with him. Jackson Dart, he's a leading rusher for that team. They're hurting. He comes in as a starter. I've talked about this before. And when he's coming in, Malik Neighbors is going out for the year. And then it's him and Scatterbo for a little bit. And Scatterbo is out for the season now as well. So in come Devin Singletary and Tracy, and neither one is doing that well. I mean, Singletary had 8 carries, but Jackson Dart had 8 carries. So those are your 2 leading rushers for the Giants. I don't know how long Dart can keep up what he's doing. I mean, he's playing hard, but it's rough when you don't have a lot of really good players to go along with you. Now, this season, none of these totals were good enough to make it into the top 10. Justin Fields still leads so far with 81 yards for the Jets in week 4, but that was in a loss. That's the number 1. And the next best is Lamar Jackson with 70. He did that in week 1, but that was in a loss as well. So those are your top 2 players right now, and then it's just dropped from the 60s and the high 50s for the rest of them. All right. Moving on to receptions. We'll look at some of these different receivers. Brock Bowers led the NFL in receptions. 12 receptions for 127 yards for the Raiders against the Jaguars, but it was in a loss. I watched that game, and I'm like, why is he not being double covered? And the last 13 passes that Geno Smith threw, I think, 12 last 13 completions he had. 12 of them were to Brock Bowers. It was like, why are we not covering Brock Bowers better? And they never changed their defense. So he seemed to be open all the time. But he had 12 receptions. Then you had 4 players with 9 receptions. And then you had 4 more with 8. So those are your top receivers as far as receptions go. So Brock Bowers, big leader there. Now Chase Brown's had 8 again, so he's been climbing the boards as far as trying to move back up into that Triple Crown status. So for the season, there's been 8 times that a player's had 11 or more receptions. So Brock Bowers was able to break into that. He had 12, which tied him with Jamar Chase, who did it last week. And like I said, Brock Bowers is the only player to make it in the top 10. Jamar Chase is on the list 3 times. Puka Nacua is on this list twice, despite being out for a bit. But Jamar Chase still leads with 16 receptions, which he had in week 7. 16. And he has number 2 spot with 14. Now, looking at receiving yards, not a big week for receivers as far as a lot of yards, though all the top 10 players had at least 100 yards, which I think is the first time that every receiver in the top 10 for a single week had at least 100 yards. So Demarius Douglas for the Patriots had 100 yards exactly. But Jackson Smith-Njigba for the Seahawks had 129 yards in a win. And then Brock Bowers for the Raiders had 127 in a loss. So those were your top 2. The Bengals had Jamar Chase with 111 yards and T. Higgins with 121 yards. You have 2 receivers with more than 100 yards and they lose the game. That's the same thing that happened with the Colts. Alec Pierce had 115 yards and Michael Pittman had 115 yards for the Colts. They both did exact same yardage, and that was in a loss. So you have 2 teams with 2 players that have at least 100 yards receiving, and both teams lost. I don't know that I've seen that really this season or any time that I can recall I'm sure it's happened several times, but I just don't recall it any time lately. All right. We're going to wrap it up there. Well, let's look at the receiving yards as a total. So like I said, it wasn't a big game. No player had a big game where they made it into the top 10, not even close. I mean, Drake London is the number 10 spot this season receiving yards. He had 158. So like I said, Jackson Smith-Njigba had 129, I believe it was. So nowhere near making the top 10. And in fact, there hasn't been a player the last 2 weeks to make it into the top 10. The last time we had 3 players in week 7 make it onto the list, including Devontae Smith, who has the lead right now this season with 183 yards in week 7. All right, so that's a look at some of your top players. And we'll pick this up when we look at some more of these stats going into tomorrow's podcast. We'll look at some more of these, and then we'll look at the standings as well. But like I said, no big numbers except for Flacco. Unfortunately for the Bengals, that was in a loss. You did have a few players, 3 players throw for over 300 yards, and 1 running back, that being Mononagay with 176 yards, was kind of the big running back, but no receivers that really stood out. Just some players like Matthew Stafford padding their numbers with another 4 touchdown passes. All right, appreciate you listening. And you'll find this podcast on YouTube at Just the Stats NFL, plus whatever app you use for podcasting if you're listening to it, which you can listen to it on YouTube as well, Apple, Spotify, or like I said, whatever podcast app you use. Please like and subscribe, and you can leave a comment if you'd like. Appreciate that. I get those now and then, and I read them when I can. Excuse me. So we will pick this up again tomorrow's episode, And so until then, that is a wrap for NFL Top 10s for Tuesday. I'm out.